Did you question whether a novelist would be qualified to tackle the subject?
To shift the beam from an imagined world to the real world doesn't necessarily involve a complete change in equipment. I want, as always, to express myself as clearly and as vividly as possible, and to follow up a perception until I get it, in a way that chimes with my inner ear. So there are, definitely literary techniques going into these essays without, I think, in any way compromising their objectivity.
On this next episode of My Martin Amos, I'm speaking to the journalist for the Sunday Times, Will Lloyd, about The Second Plane, published in 2008. Martin Amos's foray into the world of terrorism, possibility of a next global war, Islamism, Tony Blair. I think we're going to have fun talking about this. Will, thanks for joining me. It's great to have you on. First of all, let's get to the moment you really kind of knew that this was a writer that meant something to you and you wanted in some way to stay close to.
I suppose I always wanted to be a writer, and that went through various sort of gradations. So I really wanted to be a poet, but I was very bad at that. And then I tried to write fiction. I was even worse at that. And then you were left with journalism, and and then you find maybe you can do that. And so that gives me with Amos, obviously I prefer his journalism to his novels, actually. And I mean, when he interviews people, I prefer that now to almost anything else he wrote. I know that James Marriott said he prefers the kind of literary criticisms to novels, but for me, it's the reporting and the things like when he interviews Steven Spielberg. But before that, I can't remember where it came from. No memory of that. But I remember going on holiday to Magaluf after the end of my A-levels, and the book I took with me was Money by Martin Amos. And it was the moment everybody has at the start with Amos, which is, I've never read anything like this. This is so funny. How do I do this? How can I write like this? And wanting, I think he makes you, and then you read more, and he makes you want to be a writer, I think, and he really pushes you along. And there's all those little aphorisms about writing in his work, usually in his non-fiction. I think they're from his non-fiction, which is stuff like a writer is most alive when he's alone, or a writer's life is all anxiety and all ambition. And honestly, those phrases for sort of 10 years of my life were constantly in my head. They were probably being recycled every sort of 5 minutes, thinking, I'm alone, am I alive? How does this work, Martin? And then you have, then once you sort of got really full of him, and when you write, you're not writing as you would like to write. You just keep writing like Martin Amos, and you're using way too many adverbs. Then you have the process of getting rid of Martin Amos and turning away from Martin Amos and struggling with him. And then I think comes the settled acceptance. And thank God, thank God I found him. But without quite the slightly mad thinking about Martin Amos every day, which is definitely something that happened to me. You'd be thinking about Martin Amos all the time. And also everybody, so many men who write, book reviews in this country, as far as I know, own a copy of The War Against Cliché, and it's sort of near them. Even if they don't look at it, they quite like having it near them physically. And I know that sounds utterly absurd, but that is the extent of his influence, I think. It's very reassuring. And he's the Sherpa who's going to get you up the mountain. And that's, that's very powerful. When he died, I was unbelievably distraught. I must have been like, if Harry Styles died in a plane crash, his fans would all start like sort of screaming on the street. I was in Soho, and I did actually feel like the rug had been pulled beneath my feet, which I can't think of any equivalent to that for me. He's like the only person who would have that effect on me.
You summarise this book as Martin Amos going to war, metaphorically, and as you see it, being defeated?
So the moment the second plane crashes into the World Trade Center, one of the towers, I can't remember if it's the North or South Tower, apologies, but the moment the second plane crashes in, I think if you go back and you look not just at Martin Amos, but at all kinds of people, whether they're politicians or whether they're writers, obviously there is an atmosphere and a war feeling develops. And I think looking back now, after over 20 years, nearly 25 years, you look at the choices that are made in that period and you wonder whether, knowing how things would turn out, whether anybody would make any of those same choices again. And as a mad, quixotic sideshow in all of that, you have Martin Amos. You have somebody who says, in describing their own talents, he said, well, Martin Amos asks himself, what am I good at? And he says, with utter accuracy, banalities delivered with tremendous force. Martin Amos delivers banalities with tremendous force, and that has made him, on the morning where the second plane hits the tower, probably the best comic novelist in the English language at that time, and a literary celebrity, kind of the late 20th century Charles Dickens, I would say. That's probably my love of Amos coming through there. But he sits in an equivalent chair, I think, just given how famous he is. And then the plane hits the tower, and then Martin Amos and all of his cards he will play. Funnily enough, apart from the novel card, but all the other cards: Martin Amos the journalist, Martin Amos the literary critic, Martin Amos the sort of reporter, the short story writer. He will play all of them in this war. And in this book, he says it's about living with war. How do you live? How does a novelist live with war? And again, it's not just him. Everybody has a go. John Updike has a go.
I was about to say, he wasn't on his own.
And often with the work that is produced, between 9/11 and like the next 10 years, you might want to just draw a curtain over it. But today we're gonna open the curtain and we're gonna look at The Second Plane, which is, as I was saying to you earlier, weirdly is a book I own on Kindle and in hardback and have probably read, in dribs and drabs and completely, sort of more times than I really understand.
And not from an inexhaustible love of this book.
It's a horrified fascination.
See, we were originally, this listeners might like to know, going to talk about the information. And then you swerved at the last minute and you said, actually, should we talk about The Second Plane? I mean, the fact that you own it on all of these various formats shows that you've gone into it again and again and needed it. Why has the fascination been so strong?
I think because, without realising it, this book is a frightening horror story. One of the things Amos says at the start, obviously with Amos nonfiction, you usually get, I think in every Amos nonfiction, you get an author's note, and this is no exception. And he... it's almost like he knows he shouldn't have collected it. And so he tries to justify it. He said, well, why does this book exist? And he said, he immediately strikes quite a macho tone, which is not befitting of a man of his stature. And he says, but if September 11th had to happen, then I'm not at all sorry that it happened in my lifetime. Okay, so he is contemplating ruin and feeling quite ecstatic about it, which is, I think, quite a strange emotion, but obviously it can happen to any of us. And then he says, geopolitics may not be my natural subject, but masculinity is. Now, I think this is incredibly telling. Geopolitics, on the basis of this book and reading it, clearly is not his natural subject, and he probably should have kept away from it. But in justifying it, he's saying, but I understand men. I understand Islamists because they're men. And so all of the Islamists he writes about in this book, whether it's Muhammad Atta or Aid, who is a character in a short story that he never publishes, but he writes about at length in this book, are they Islamists? Are they accurate representations of what Islamists are like in real life, which is kind of what he's saying? Or are they Martin Amos characters? Are they Keiths? And I think they're Keiths. And again, as a sideshow in the War on Terror, where loads of people get loads of things wrong, and there are terrible consequences, this is actually quite revealing about the West in that period, because Martin Amos, a lot of these pieces, they're published in the New York Times, they're published in the Times of London, they're published in the Guardian, the Observer. Martin Amos was explaining Islamism to, for want of a better phrase, the liberal middle classes of England, and in smaller amounts, I suppose, the Americans. And he was trusted to do that, and I think he failed, just like the war failed. So he's this odd mirror of this massive process that's going on, and now we don't really talk about it because, remember the planes left Kabul, and, and we try not to think about it too much. But this happened, and Martin Amos was in it, as a part of history, as a revealing part of history, and that's why this book. I suppose the frightening thing about that, also as a kind of sub level of that, is Martin Amos, as I said, is the best comic novelist. He doesn't know he's the best comic novelist. He thinks he's this man who understands men, which means he can understand Iran, which is crazy, which is mad. If you're as old as Amos is when this all starts in his 50s, you want to know yourself, I think. And he's so good at other people, and so good, as we will see in this book. There's an amazing profile of Tony Blair. He can look at somebody and find things out about them. He's a brilliant novelist, but he doesn't know who he is.
Very interesting that you have come to this conclusion, and there's a writer that you mentioned has summed up for you why this book fails ultimately, but we'll come back to that later.
Yeah.
What about the first essay you read where something felt off? Because as well as everything else, he was a self-proclaimed authority on good writing, and you say that peppered throughout this book are just the most awful howlers. And I have to agree. I actually found myself, as I put it to you, it sounded like a man who was mixing a cocktail of his own medicine to calm the nerves, the fear of somebody who'd witnessed the two planes going into the World Trade Center and having to say something big about this. Together, those two things made him pretty jittery, it sounds like, from what he writes.
Yeah, I think as a note to listeners, again, this is coming from a place of love, and Martin Amos is not the only novelist to be caught up in history. Like Charles Dickens writes some stupid shit about the Indian Mutiny. Writers do lose it a bit when big things happen. But I suppose there are sort of two categories of error that stand out to me. Actually, no, three, which are the sweeping statements. So I think he says that what does he say? All religions are by their nature violent. He says something like that. He says Islam is a totalist religion. So these big statements that I think under any kind of scrutiny fall apart and they sweep along. And then there's his use of analogy. So he will compare Islamism in this book to Pol Pot, Hitler, Stalin. I mean, he's writing House of Meetings during this period. So there's a lot of Russian stuff in this book. And I know that Islamism has been compared to Leninism in some ways, and you might be able to draw some links there. But again, with historical analogies, I think they can be very dangerous and they can really obscure things. And you have to ask with the analogy, not in a spirit of nitpicking, but in a spirit of, does this reveal something to us? And so when Amos is comparing, Said Qutb's book Milestones with Mein Kampf, I think he's just saying they're bad, which is fine, but you don't need the analogy to say, you don't need to bring Mein Kampf in to say Said Qutb is wrong. You don't need to do it. And it makes it feel like he's learned it on the hoof a little bit. And then I think the very first essay, or op-ed, I suppose, is part of a series The Guardian published after 9/11, where they got big name. It tells you about the status actually of writers even not that long ago, that the response of The Guardian was, let's get all the novelists to say something. And they don't quite do it in the same way now, I'm afraid.
You could say there's a good reason for that. I mean, if they were to say, here's why we don't do that anymore, I could have some sympathy for that.
No, you're right. And also, I think, I can't remember who said on this podcast before, there's this question of, and it does apply to Amos, and people have said this about Amos many times, is searching for the big subject. And I can't remember who said it on the podcast, but they said they felt that it was sort of ludicrous, Amos's search for a big subject. I know I've sort of said that, but there's another part of me that admires it. It admires that he's like, I'm a writer, everything is open to me, and therefore, I will ride in on my horse when the village is being burnt down. I
mean, isn't that why we like Amos, if we're honest?
No, the reason why we like him is because he's funny, and that is actually really difficult. I mean, what does he say in the War Against Cliché? He lists what he likes about what good writing is, and he says freshness, energy, and reverberation of voice. And really, he's talking about himself because he has most of the time all of that. In this, because he is relying on the work of other people, when he's writing about Islam, there is no freshness, there is no energy, and there is no reverberation of voice. And his attempts to apply the Amos style, so he's always sort of coining words in this book. I know he does that all over the place. The world flash of the coming future, the age of vanished normalcy, the age of horrorism. He's like, terrorism isn't enough. We've got to call it horrorism. It's like, no, Martin, terrorism is definitely enough. That's fine. Because horrorism doesn't have freshness, energy, or I'm not a literary critic, but to me, it's clearly a style being applied to a subject where the resulting fire doesn't really crackle, doesn't really burn.
We're looking for a good example of where the wheels start to come off, in your view.
Yes, okay, well, we can turn to page 3, which is the...
Will this be the first reading?
The first page, yeah.
All right.
Okay, the second plane. It was the advent of the second plane, sharking in low over the Statue of Liberty. That was the defining moment. Until then, America thought she was witnessing nothing more serious than the worst aviation disaster in history. Now she had a sense of the fantastic vehemence ranged against her. I have never seen a generically familiar object so transformed by affect, emotion, and desire as influencing behaviour. The second plane looked eagerly alive and galvanised with malice, and wholly alien. For those thousands in the second tower, the second plane meant the end of everything. For us, its glint was the world flash of a coming future. Terrorism is political communication by other means. The message of September the 11th ran as follows: America, it is time you learned how implacably you are hated.
And then we have the infamous world flash of a coming future.
Let's
go through it then.
It's very dramatic. I mean, as it probably should be. I suppose it's so over the top that it makes you think, was it that?
See, that's it. I remember, albeit as a 12-year-old, that event. And I don't really feel like I'm sent back to that time by reading anything he describes.
No. The thing is it wrong to say its glint was the world flash of a coming future? Now, what Amos, I think, means there, and we have to sort of settle down and think about what is he actually saying here. I think he's saying, and a lot of people felt this at the time and for years afterwards, that there would be many more spectacular incidences of terrorism. That hasn't really happened. Terrorism's a bit more DIY and a bit more sort of banal now. It's not this sort of Hollywood event, which is what 9/11 is. But he's saying its glint was the world flash of a coming future, as in this is going to happen all the time now. And it's too, he's going too far almost. He's too excited. And also there's a kind of, because it is brilliant in its own way, it's almost disrespectful, I think, to the actual event. It's almost using the event as a vehicle for his style, whereas it should be the other way around.
I think you've nailed it. Another really good example of exactly what you described there is where he writes, "We speak of plane rage, but it was the plane itself that was in frenzy," one felt, as it gunned and steadied and then smeared itself into the South Tower. Smearing itself.
Brilliant.
It's a nice description. But then he says, even the flames and smoke were opulently evil, with their vampiric reds and blacks.
One of the interesting things about that series of Guardian essays or responses is how frightened everybody sounds. And I know we're saying he is scared. He is definitely scared in this book, but they all sound really quite worried. Like if you read Zadie Smith's one, she talks about not wanting to write, and she says like she's sick of the sound of her own voice, she's sick of her writing, she's sick of everything, she doesn't know how to deal with this. And it doesn't really sound like Zadie Smith because she's sort of in shock. And many other writerly responses to 9/11, David Foster Wallace writes this essay about flags in Middle America and how everyone put their flag out. And there's a kind of restrained, funereal pace to that essay. And it's very beautiful, actually. It's very good. But Martin Amos sounds like Martin Amos. It's all of the tricks, the coining of words, the adverbs out of nowhere. It's still kind of funny somehow. The sort of exuberance of his voice. It's like a man sort of telling jokes at a funeral almost, and not appropriately gallows humor ones, like sort of Roy Chubby Brown jokes almost. It's just way over the top, I think. But then I guess the corollary is, well, wasn't this way over the top? I mean, wasn't this event way over the top? And so you can see how you can sympathize with him as he gets there, while realizing, or maybe that's too far. No, while thinking, no, this doesn't quite work.
How old were you when the plane struck?
I was 7, and I do remember it because I remember getting in the car. I was picked up from school, and I remember my mother helpfully saying, "America is under attack, and the Prime Minister is in hiding," which you don't forget that. You do remember that.
He was in Brighton.
He was at the Trade Union Congress. He made a speech and then started and then hid. And where were you?
As I mentioned earlier, I was 12 years old. I walked back from school. I sat down in front of the TV. I started just watching stuff, as you do. And the channels started jumping about. Channel 3 was Channel 1. Channel 1 was Channel 2. My parents were in the same room upstairs and had a very small TV in their bedroom. A lot of channels had changed to the same image of a smoking building. Mm-hmm. And we recognized it because a year before, in September, we'd been stood at the top of the World Trade Center as a family. Deadly silence. There were no tears as such. We were just in pure shock. And then I think the next day, mainly groups of boys were all stood around talking about how we were all going to be sent to war.
Oh my God.
12-year-old boys, all convinced that world flash of a coming future was upon us.
But that I mean, it was very heightened. Of course it was.
Yeah.
And in that sort of quivering emotional state, many mistakes would go on to be made.
Yeah.
The best response from Amos would have been to just keep writing comic novels and being the best person at writing comic novels and making people laugh.
But no one wants to do their dad's job, as he famously said.
As he said, didn't Kingsley invade Normandy? I mean, I might be getting that wrong, but his father did fight in a war, and I think all the men of that generation who grew up in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, they grew up with World War II comics and World War II films. I think they're all haunted by that sensation of, should that have been me? What does my slightly decadent life amount to? I mean, it's his best friend Hitchens saying, my father sunk that Nazi naval vessel, and that was a better day's work done there than I've ever done in my life. And I think in a New Yorker profile of Hitchens, his wife attributes his sort of pugilism to the fact that he never got to fight in World War II. And that line in the author's note by Amos, where he says, "I'm glad it happened in my lifetime." What? You're glad the deaths of 3,000 people for absolutely no reason happened in your lifetime? I mean, what? I think that is a bit of Hitchensy influence, and there is a bit of Hitchensy influence throughout this. I think, in the sense that it was, even though Amos is at pains to say he never agrees with the Iraq War, so he doesn't make the big dumb error which we still live with now, but he does feel like writers can fight. Writers should fight. And I think that is to do with being Christopher Hitchens' best friend at this time. How could it not?
Let's talk about Martin Amos the Theophobe, because it comes out so strongly in this book.
All religions are violent. I mean, that's a big old claim, isn't it? I mean, couldn't we say all ideologies are violent? Couldn't we say human beings are inherently violent? Couldn't we? It's such a big tent that I think we'd all get lost inside it if we started thinking about it. Now, remember, one of his good friends is Salman Rushdie. Another very good friend is Christopher Hitchens. So he's got one person who's very much been on the receiving end of the worst that religion can deal out in some ways, and then in the other, he's got a friend who has decided that he's Thomas Paine. So there's a heavy influence on him. But I don't actually think that Martin Amos, born in Swansea, live a long time in Hampstead, dies in Florida. I don't think, and also, again, hasn't spent his life thinking about these things. I don't value his sweeping judgments on religion. I don't think they're particularly insightful. And again, it was very much part of the atmosphere of the time. This is when, Richard Dawkins is on Channel 4, making documentaries about how all religions are evil. And there was a definite feeling in the air, very much pushed, by liberals in Britain and America, that we had to defend the Enlightenment. We had to defend rationality. And obviously, as we carried our Enlightenment project into Afghanistan and Iraq, and we started trying to teach, the women of Afghanistan about like gender fluidity or whatever, and trying to, take a country that is roughly divided between Shia, Sunni, and Kurds into a democracy. Well, actually, that wasn't rational. That was irrational rationality. That was a rational project carried into utter absurdity, which again, Amos is like this little sideshow going on while this madness is being unleashed. And so that gives this book its kind of tragic character, I think, or its unsettling and frightening character is how I'd probably think about it. Because Martin Amos isn't an idiot. He is clever. He does understand things. But this is actually too big for him. It's probably too big for anybody, actually. And, it gets him in trouble. It gets not a good kind of trouble. I think it gets him in the bad kind of trouble. So one of the things he says while he's writing this book is he talks about... it's the most explosive thing in this period for Martin Amos, which is he says in an interview, there's a definite urge, don't you have it, to say the Muslim community will have to suffer until it gets its house in order. Now, obviously, the follow-up question is, what kind of suffering do you mean, Martin? Not letting people travel, deportation further down the road, curtailing of freedoms, strip searching people who look like they're from the Middle East or from Pakistan. Now, even Michel Houellebecq, uber French, Prince of Darkness, literary, bad man, doesn't go that far. And he fights off court cases about what he says about Islam. And Amos is then, it's almost like a cultural moment, really. I think now we'd think of it as part of the culture wars, but then it was a world flash. It was a glint of the culture wars to come. And Amos ends up on sort of Channel 4 News with Terry Eagleton absolutely tearing strips out of him, and in columnists with The Independent saying that he's like a BNP thug and all this kind of stuff. And Amos is a man of great sensitivity and fears, and he later, much later, in an interview with The Times, will say, I'm like Hugh Hefner. I was a hero of liberalism, and then liberalism kind of changed, and it moved on without me. And he becomes self-aware about these things, and I think he ends up apologizing for those remarks. But what we see here is somebody of a liberal disposition, of a live and let live disposition, essentially, panicking after 9/11, wondering whether you can... He probably wouldn't think of it like this, but essentially flirting with illiberalism and authoritarianism as a thought experiment and thinking it out loud, and not realizing that if you do that, you may get quite an illiberal response to you. Actually, if you propose liberal measures, then the reaction might be, let's shut this guy up, let's tear this guy down, and that's what happens to him. And so it's a little tremor again of the future. There's actually one thing that I thought was really, really, really interesting rereading this. And again, like any great artist, Martin Amos can kind of see the future. Like they always can. And
while you're searching for that, I think it's worth mentioning that, where he says his natural subject is masculinity. I mean, I think in a way he wasn't afraid of channeling maybe that macho urge within him to say things like, we should all just round them up and search them, He wasn't afraid of saying, look, if this is my natural subject, then occasionally I'm going to show that the reason it's my natural subject is because it inheres in me. And
it also, again, it's a bit like Dickens and the Indian Mutiny, because like Dickens is very much like cut all their heads off, stuff them into cannons, kill them all. And it's Dickens, it's Oliver Twist. It's the most sentimental writer in English fiction, bar absolutely nobody. Ridiculous sentimentality, like it's so saccharine that your teeth fall out. And yet there he is, kill them all. Kill, Starship Troopers Dickens, who wants to just kill everybody. And yeah, you're right. It is a kind of, but it's protesting too much.
It's an impotent anger. It
is a kind of impotent anger because it's not going to happen. He talks about, so I think he's a decent writer in America, and he says at one point he says this is him seeing the future in a way he doesn't realize. So this is, again, he's talking about how America should respond to 9/11, and he says, on the US-led side, then we need not only a revolution in consciousness, but an adaptation of national character, the work perhaps of a generation. Now, a generation has passed. Has there been a revolution in national in consciousness, in the United States with regards to issues surrounding sort of foreign policy, geopolitics, culture? I mean, absolutely there has been. And I was reading that I was reading that as there were the protests in Colombia. Now, whatever you think about that, something has clearly changed inside a generation in America.
What do you think has changed?
Well, there's much more. If you look at polling now, between now and then, in 2001, much more anti-Israel sentiment abroad in the United States. There's been, serious discussions and probably policy about reparations in America for slavery. You had this crazy moment, which is actually more sort of germane to this, which is when everybody was reading Osama bin Laden on TikTok. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
They were all reading, and I thought, and they were young Americans were saying, wow, Osama bin Laden maybe had a point. And thousands of people were doing this. And I thought, there is your revolution in consciousness, Mr. Amos. Like, what do you think of it? I'm not sure if he knew what kind of revolution in consciousness I'm not sure he knew what he wanted, but he wanted a revolution in consciousness. And I think absolutely 9/11 was so unsettling that it has produced a revolution in consciousness in the United States. And so he's right.
There has been a revolution in consciousness. Much of that has happened on the part of a generation who did not experience and have no living memory of 9/11.
Yes.
And having been born in the internet. And again, I only wish that what you read in this book could actually give you a sense of that, as opposed to opulently evil flames and molten mullahs and, sharking planes, etc.
And bad stuff about Iran.
Yeah.
It doesn't really stand up.
But let's talk about On the Move with Tony Blair.
Yeah.
Because that essay I really enjoyed. I did think, and I think you think too, that he really does capture something of Blair that rings true even of today.
Yes.
And maybe that's where we can get a second reading from you. I don't know. But where do you want to begin with that?
So Amos is sent by The Guardian to go on a kind of valedictory tour with Tony Blair. And he gets really good access. He's on the plane, he's in the car. He follows him to a sort of trade unions congress, I think. He goes to Belfast with him. He goes to Iraq with him. And what he's doing is a classic magazine political profile. But I think what we should say is what I think, if you spend any time around politicians or the events that politicians go to, and this is something I've sadly kind of aged into, you realise that they're unbelievably dull and unbelievably hard to write about if you want to say something original. You fall into these traps, and they give nothing. Politicians are so difficult to interview because they're really, really careful not to say anything. And then on the other end of that, you have your editor saying, get something new.
You've had this experience yourself.
Well, I mean, but yes. So get a new line out of them when they don't want to give it to you. And Amos is very much aware that, like, he does need to get something out of Blair, but he knows he's not. I think he knows Blair's not going to say anything, because Blair is, unbelievably good at this. So Blair's not really going to say anything to Martin Amos, which is going to change the way you think about Tony Blair. But what Martin Amos has, and it's all through this piece, is powers of observation that shame us all. So Martin Amos gets packed into, I think it's a C. What is it? It's Martin Amos gets packed into a Hercules C-130 transport plane because he's going from Kuwait City to Baghdad in the trail of Tony Blair, and then I think it's just so good. Something happened to Blair in Basra. At the airport base, which is pretty well all that's left of the operation in the south, the city having been abandoned to the general atomization, Shia factions, tribal militias, armed gangs. There'd been several handshakes in the coffee bar, the old VIP room in which many Iraqis once braced themselves for the Hajj, and several hundred 10-second conversations. There had been a reasonably good speech, reasonably well received. Blair then repaired to a side room for a closed session, with the padre, several officers, and about 25 young soldiers. And something happened. There was a haunting paragraph from the padre about the hard and dark side of recent events at the camp. Many losses, many unspeakable injuries. About transformative experiences. About the way these young people have had to grow up so very quickly. And when it came to Blair, all the oxygen went out of him. It wasn't just that he seemed acutely underbriefed on munitions, projects, tactics. he was quite unable to find weight of voice, to find decorum, the appropriate words for the appropriate mood. So we kill more of them than they kill us. You're getting back out there and after them. It's brilliant, actually. The PM, it has to be said, appeared to be the least articulate man in the room. The least articulate. And also the youngest. Now, what's so wonderful about that is he's seen something that Blair wouldn't want us to see, because he's able to ensure a mood and an atmosphere and a feeling in a room. He's also captured something, I think, about Blair and that generation of politicians, which goes back to something we were saying earlier, which is that they had never really had these big experiences of war, and they had never really had to fight and die in the trenches like, Harold Macmillan or Attlee or anyone like that. And this kind of insane project in Iraq does start to feel like making up for something. And in the same way that this book doesn't really find weight of voice, decorum, the appropriate words for the appropriate mood, neither does Blair. And I find it a very haunting passage about a prime minister who gambled everything on this war and thought he was right, and not even being able to summon the language to make a room of these soldiers who he is effectively responsible for look at him as somebody they could respect and admire. I think that's the subtext of those paragraphs. And I think only you would never, ever, ever get that if they'd sent, say, the Sunday Telegraph's, political editor, who I believe at that time was Matthew D'Ancona. If they'd sent him along with Blair to Basra, you wouldn't have got that. You don't really get stuff like that in political journalism, even though that happens all the time in politics. There are always these moments when it doesn't go well for them. And TV cameras can't capture that. Only a very, very good writer can do that. And that's, you suddenly the whole book, you forget about the rest of it and you think, yes, it's like, yes, thank God that's there.
Matt D'Ancona, the first guest on this podcast.
Oh, God, sorry, Matt.
I know, I'd love to know what he thinks of this, given his role at the time. I remember at the end of this article, you get Martin Amos asking Blair, who it's no secret, obviously, is a huge celebrity as well as the Prime Minister at that point. He was very good at being both. Those autographs are for my daughters, I said, in the den at Downing Street, much later on, but before the day trip to Iraq. They'll kill me if I forget. Just scribble them on my pad here. Oh no, we'll need prime ministerial paper for this. The little ones want your phone number too. She's 7. Expect her call. I think the number's on the letterhead. No, just the address. He looked up with obliging expectancy. So it's Fernanda? Yes. And the little one. With an I, not an E. And no, there never is any respite. Cleo, I said. The muse of history. Cleo. There we are. So how does it feel, now that it's ebbing away from you? Power. All right so far. When the day comes, I'll probably be clinging to the door knocker. I'm homeless. But so far, I think I can just let it go. But you couldn't, could you, Tony?
I mean, him calling the Oval Office a futuristic academy, perhaps of pure power, and, the people, IDing him in there. Incarnations of disgusted skepticism, zero tolerance with prideful tension and frigidity of high protocol. Its peculiar American flavour is evident in the sustained choreography and the dread of the spontaneous. It's a very, very good... there's a series of very, very good observations about what it feels like to be around power as it is constituted in Britain and America. There's actually one tiny bit as well where he writes about 10 Downing Street, which I just think is so funny, which is number 10 Downing Street, broad, tall and deep, has the appearance of a country hotel with the furnishings of a Harley Street waiting room, and there is a mid-stairs feel to it. You go past the discreetly burping doorman, and for every striding or trotting secretary, for every spin doctor and dreamily cruising technocrat, there's a bloke trundling past with a rubbish barrel or a porter's trolley. And it's like thank God Martin Amos got to just sit there and look at it. I read something years and years later by a Polish journalist called Ryszard Kapuscinski, and it's about, he lived in Iran during the time of the revolution there for many months, and he was a Polish foreign correspondent and was filing his dispatches back to Poland. But at the same time, he wrote this book, Shah of Shahs. It's about the downfall of the Shah and what happened. And there's this moment which just made me think of Amos and the sort of larger sort of Western world after 9/11. And this is towards the end of Shah of Shahs, and he's been in Iran for a long, long time. And this is what Kapuscinski says. I'm trying to understand them, but over and over again, I stumble into a dark region and lose my way. They have a different attitude to life and death. They react differently to the sight of blood. At the sight of blood, they become tense, fascinated. They fall into some sort of mystical trance. I can see their animated gestures and hear their cries. The owner of a nearby restaurant pulled up in front of my hotel in his new car. It was a brand new Pontiac, gold, straight from the dealer. There was some commotion, and I could hear chickens being slaughtered in the courtyard. First, the people sprinkled the chicken blood over themselves, and then they smeared it on the body of the car. In a moment, the automobile was red and dripping blood. This was the baptism of the Pontiac. Wherever there is blood, they crowd around to dip their hands in it. They could not explain to me why this is necessary. Now, the writing is very good. And also, there's a frank admission I don't understand. I don't understand what is happening. And I read that years after, reading this, and just found it just such a sort of powerful moment of, in Shah of Shahs, he then leaves the country soon after that. I think just being able to say, at some level, I'm not going to get this. I don't understand it.
Did you immediately think about Martin Amos in The Second Plane when you read?
Literally, immediately started thinking of...
the sheer contrast.
The sheer contrast, also of somebody... Also, what I respect about Kapuscinski is he was there. I mean, he was there and he was living there. And he tried to understand. Amos has read some books by, Bernard Lewis. It's very interesting who he quotes in this book. He, read some books by Bernard Lewis, by Paul Berman. We have the usual Amos clutch of Updike, Bellow, DeLillo. A couple of quotes from Lenin, Gorky, Stalin for some reason. A bit of Hitchens, Sam Harris, Eric Hobsbawm. That's not enough. If the stakes are as high as Amos says they are, which is living with war, you need to do more work, I think. You need to... Or entrust the work to somebody who knows what they're doing.
With that in mind, how has this book benefited you as a journalist?
I mean, obviously, with the Blair thing, it does make you think about all of the crap that surrounds power, all of these odd little rituals around power, and how to observe them, and whether there's space for them in writing about power in this country now, because they're all still there, and if anything, have got even more absurd and stupid. So you do wonder if you can get away with what Amos was able to get away with.
Would you want to?
Oh, of course. I mean, of course, it would be much more fun. Well, it depends on the subject, the decision about whether you're in it or not, and you have to be in it for a good reason. But I suppose it's more, you want to be able to explain to the reader that the smooth product that they're being fed, which I think everybody is pretty suspicious of at this point, but the smooth packaging of, say, television, when it's doing politics, is not what it's like. You should know about the discreetly burping doorman. You should know about the porters trundling away. It's not saying it's corrupt or anything. It's just saying that you should know that it is kind of normal and a bit naff. Like, that should be part of the story we tell about politics, because maybe that might make people think it should be better. Which you read that piece about Blair and you do sort of wonder, what do we do to these people? Like, what do we do to prime ministers? That's why I came away from it from. But I think with the questions about, with the sort of broader question about, writing about religion or writing about other countries, it's just wanting to take care. Because Amos takes absolutely no care at all. Doesn't feel like his old word about decorum doesn't feel very decorous, this book. Feels at times like he's forgotten himself. While actually I'm contradicting myself, aren't I? Because he is being himself in sort of this massive way and applying himself to this subject, but it's not Doesn't make sense.
I think this has been a wonderful exploration of a collection that many people will probably never have gotten round to reading. And I think probably the reason to read it, what would that be?
Oh, failure is much more interesting than success. People learn much more from failure than success, don't they? I mean, this is Martin Amos failing, and that is, to me, at least as interesting, if not as funny, as Martin Amos in London Fields. You want to see somebody who is brilliant have a rough day at the office, not in a vindictive way, but just because you want to you want to learn something from it. I think you actually learn more from this book about Martin Amos and the sort of last third of his career than you do from any other, from Inside Story or from Lionel Asbo or House of Meetings or The Pregnant Widow. I think this is the book to read to understand the late Amos trajectory and where he's going, and as he realizes like how he's dating in some ways. And I don't think we'll remember this book this wasn't, I don't think the obituaries were leading with The Second Plane, but it tells us a lot about Amos, and it tells, more importantly, the most important thing is it tells us a lot about that period after 9/11 and the frenzy to judgment and the frenzy, the clamour for war that happened. And it can help us, hopefully, now this is getting very grand, but like not do that again.
Kingsley Amos, what do you think he would have made of The Second Plane?
The funny thing about that question is that Kingsley Amos sort of famously loved the Vietnam War and really enjoyed the spectacle of American power in Southeast Asia. So I wonder if Kingsley Amos would have been actually sort of to the right of Martin, as it were. It's hard to find Amos statements about politics. He's vaguely anti-political correctness. Actually, no, he's quite specifically anti-political correctness, but not in a way that leads him to join any kind of move. He's not a joiner in, for want of a much better phrase. He doesn't really like crowds. There's that famous bit where he says he had to stop going to QPR because everybody smelled cheese and onion crisps. He doesn't really like being in crowds. He's a bit spooked by them. And this is Amos as part of an intellectual movement, actually, after, the tough liberals after 9/11. And it doesn't, the clothes don't fit. And so he eventually goes back to writing, one more comic novel about London, one more comic novel about sex, and then another memoir. And also, actually, I'm now remembering things, but he really sends a rejoinder to this entire book when in 2014 he writes a story for The New Yorker about migration in Europe, which is quite a strange, almost auto-fiction piece, but in its sensitivity to what is going on in Europe, actually, and in its attempt to be human about that movement of people, you do feel him almost quietly putting this book aside and saying, I've thought about this a bit more, and maybe I don't understand everything, and maybe people, maybe that flirtation with deport people, time up, all that stuff that he was going on about, maybe that's over. And I think he does change and develop, but that's a suspicion. He doesn't quite say that.
I've enjoyed this one immensely, Will. Thank you so much.
Cheers, Jack.